So I think it's important to understand, uh, where yoga's at right now in the general population. This cartoon reads, in addition to 16 cup holders, it comes equipped with 4 dedicated yoga mat storage areas, which suggests that yoga has become so popular that we're designing our cars with yoga in mind. And although we don't have that yet, we do have actually yoga mats with cars on them. So if you go to this website for $75, you can get a car imprinted on your yoga mat, and I've chosen to have a 1966 Lamborghini. Now, this popularity of yoga is actually documented by surveys, particularly in the United States, where the surveys are well done. And what you can see is this remarkable trend from 2002 to 2017. It's almost exponential. It's increased in 50% in these 2 5-year intervals here. So if that happens again, we'll be at 21% of the population in 2022. But 14% of the population doing anything, this represents really a major movement in society. This is a significant fraction of the population. It's actually become part of the culture. Now, this is also true in our children, and we can see this in the US statistics. The number of children practicing yoga from 2012 to 2017 has jumped from 3% to 8.4%, and those also practicing meditation have also increased. So this is a growing movement around the world, I think. Another metric that you can use is in the culture is the toys that children practice, because this archaeologically is a metric of what the culture was doing at the time. And we now have this made to move Barbie doll, and she's made to move so she can be articulated into many different yoga postures. In fact, there's even a Breathe With Me Barbie that comes with 5 guided meditations. And that for those that want to move to the next step, there is a yoga teacher Barbie. And yoga teacher Barbie comes complete with a yoga mat and a water bottle. And then for those of a different persuasion, I was brought up with toy soldiers. These are yoga joes. They don't carry bazookas or rifles, but they are doing yoga asanas. I think it's important to understand, this talk is all about research and science. Why would we want to do research on yoga? Yoga has become quite popular on its own, so why do we need the research? And I sometimes feel like this cartoon, I'm one of those scientists that studies things that pretty much everyone already knows. And so the answer is really, I like to phrase it in the reverse. Why not do research on yoga? First of all, it's very costly. In the US, that's $2 million for a full study, $700,000 for a preliminary trial. Not only that, but it's very long. Studies are 5 years, or preliminary trials are 3 years long. And one study doesn't do much. You get 1 or 2 papers out of it. And it really requires dozens of studies and a critical mass of papers before you can make policy changes in society. Furthermore, yoga is very different than yoga research. Yoga research and research in general is reductionistic, dualistic, and almost dehumanizing in a way, and yoga is almost virtually the opposite. So why should we be doing research on yoga? And the primary answer is really to reach populations that ordinarily do not have access to and or knowledge of yoga. We're talking about accessibility, we're talking about knowledge of yoga, we're talking about underserved populations. But that may sound strange because I've just showed you how popular yoga is. And the challenge really here is in the details. It is mostly women that are practicing yoga. In the US, it's 70%. In many European countries, it's 90% women. It's mostly adults, leaving out children and the elderly. It's mostly white, leaving out minorities. And then in the US, it's mostly college educated, many with a degree, and many earning $75,000 a year, and a subfraction earning over $100,000 a year, which are very high levels. So this really represents a very narrow sliver of the demographic. In fact, a highly educated, highly well-incomed fraction of the population, that's mostly women. And so that really is a form of social injustice, if you will. It's leaving out a lot of these minorities. And we see that in the children as well. You can see that in terms of yoga, it's 11% are girls and 5% boys are practicing. So that's a very different demographic gender-wise that translates to the children. It's also true For children aged 4 to 17, it's dominated by non-Hispanic whites in the U.S. So right now we're seeing this sort of global movement of yoga being practiced in ashram studios, yoga centers, gyms, and spas in the general population. But we are seeing some of a trickle into what I'm calling mainstream society and mainstream society's institutions, the public schools, the workplaces, and the healthcare system. Now, obviously, if we were able to bring yoga into the public schools, then every child would get yoga. So then, by definition, we would solve this social injustice and take care of this disparity. The problem with this transition is that research is required. So the school system is already at bursting at the seams, trying to educate kids with everything they need to learn to succeed in society. We're asking them to take something out so we can put yoga in. That's going to require some degree of justification, and that justification has to be a research study that shows that the benefits of giving yoga to children outweigh the negatives of taking the time and the resources to teach them that yoga. And the same applies to the workplace and the healthcare system. Research is really critical to justify this inclusion into mainstream society's institutions. How is it we're the most successful species on the planet, yet we need to pay people to remind us to breathe and drink water? And yoga is not something that comes automatically. We don't pop out of the womb with a yoga mat. So we have to learn these strategies. They have to be taught to us. And so in Western society, they haven't been very popular over the past centuries, whereas these types of contemplative practices are more common in the Oriental countries. So turning to the psychophysiology of yoga, how does yoga work on the mind and the body? What's the research showing this? And this is an area of growing intensity, and we have a lot of research studies that are being published at a high frequency, and that seems to be accelerating. In fact, you can see evidence of that even at Harvard Medical School. There's a book published from Harvard Medical School, a special health report. I was asked to be the medical editor, an introduction to yoga. And in this book, there's a lot of pages devoted to the research that's been done on yoga. In fact, if you go to the Harvard Health Publishing website, there's actually articles on yoga and its benefits, this one being anxiety and depression. It's almost as though Harvard Medical School is promoting yoga practice. And so this is a really remarkable transition as well, showing that yoga's popularity is growing not just in the public, but also in academic and medical circles. We've published a chapter summarizing the psychophysiology of yoga in our landmark textbook, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. This is an edited medical textbook with 60 yoga researchers contributing, and this is really putting yoga into modern science and modern science languaging and really describing the research that's been done. Now, going back to some of the early research, it really gives us clues as to where yoga is working. Some of the early research was targeted at long-term yoga practitioners in India, these yogis and fakirs who are doing these fantastic things with their bodies. And so one of the types of study was to get these advanced practitioners and hook them up to this recording equipment you see in this study they conducted in India in the 50s. And over a year, they did these studies on these advanced practitioners and concluded that physiologically, yogic meditation represents deep relaxation of the autonomic nervous system. And this is a key. This is an underlying construct that is underneath all of yoga, but also the entire field of what we call mind-body medicine. The idea that through these trainings of yoga and other types of practices, we can develop self-regulation of our internal state, both psychological functioning as well as physical or physiological functioning. And this is significant because in modern society and modern medicine, this is a construct that's virtually absent. In our medical system, the doctor treats you. The doctor does things to you. You get pills, you get surgery. And here is the construct that suggests that patients have, through the ability, through these practices, to develop some degree of control and self-regulation. The autonomic nervous system is significant because it's one of the systems that's involved in managing the stress and emotion response. And another system is also under control is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, whose stress hormone is cortisol. And these systems seem to be under self-regulation that develops when you engage in yoga practices over time. Now, of course, the physical postures and exercises are different than Western type aerobic exercises. And one way to envision this is to compare these in some way. So this is a study looking at fat mass percent, sort of important cardiovascular health regulator. And what we can see is that in this study, they looked at long distance runners and sprinters and compared them to people that didn't do heavy exercise. And what you can see is that their fat mass percent levels are much lower. They're much healthier than in normals. But here's yoga. Despite being much less aerobically active than a long distance running or sprinting, there's just as much health benefit to yoga practice with respect to this cardiovascular outcome. So there's something about yoga practice that's very good physically compared to Western type exercises. We also have very good evidence on the practices of breath techniques, particularly the long, slow breathing. This study, for example, shows that when people in this study engaged in slow breathing, their systolic blood pressure was reduced during the slow breathing and then returned to normal. In fact, there's a whole body of research now in which scientists are looking at slow breathing as a treatment for hypertension, for high blood pressure. Other studies have shown that yoga breathing practices, particularly slow breathing, can reduce our stress response, can affect central nervous system functioning, and it can even change the characteristics of our respiratory system. It's a much more efficient form of breathing than regular faster paced breathing. This is an example of a study looking at slow breathing on stress. In this randomized controlled trial, the controls were subjected to a stressful situation, and you can see their increase in the levels of their perceived stress. The other group was given a slow breathing intervention, and what you can see is that their stress response was much lower. So this breathing practice has a very direct and immediate impact on our perceived stress. And there's also other studies that show that it modulates emotion and modulates pain very effectively as well. Now, jumping forward to some modern science, looking at brain activity, is these studies that look at brain activity in these brain scanners. These are very precise. They can identify which nuclei in the brain are affected by meditation practice, and we can see those changes from second to second. And one of the types of studies that's been done is to compare the brain activity of those people that meditate over the long term compared to those that don't meditate at all. And we can see changes, and a number of studies have been done like that. This one study showed that the observed changes appear in structures that underlie the attention network and also those that relate to emotion and autonomic function. So we've already talked about an emotion and autonomic function, so we're seeing a good concordance in the brain activity with that. And it's no surprise that the attention networks are changed because meditation within yoga practice is the control of attention. We're engaging our attention networks in the brain, and so it's no surprise that we see changes in the attention networks. We can also see changes in brain structure. This is called neuroplasticity. It's well known that the brain can change its structure to our certain behaviors, and this is change in yoga. And this is looking at pain tolerance to cold. And this has looked at long-term yoga practitioners in the black dots and compared their pain tolerance to those of non-yoga practitioners here in the open circles. And the non-practitioners are clustered at the lower end of pain tolerance, whereas the long-term yoga practitioners are clustered at the higher end of cold pain tolerance, suggesting that there's something about long-term yoga practice that improves your ability to manage pain. On the vertical axis of this graph, they've also calculated the volume of the region of the brain involved in pain regulation. And what you can see is that on average, the long-term yoga practitioners have higher volume of that region of the brain compared to the non-yoga practitioners. And on this graph on the right, they looked at how many years the long-term practitioners have been practicing, and there's a correlation such that the longer they had practiced yoga, the larger that region of the brain was. So what these powerful studies are telling us is that we're making significant changes in our central nervous system. We're changing brain activity and we're changing brain structure. So this is really bringing us into sort of the modern medicine, very objective, strong evidence that yoga can make very significant, statistically significant changes and actually clinically significant changes. Now this cartoon reads, meditation isn't what you think, which has a double meaning. And of course, when we meditate, when we focus our attention in meditation, whether it's mindfulness meditation or concentrative single point focus meditation, mind wandering intrudes after a while. And so we have this cycle during meditation practice of mental focus with intrusions of mind wandering, which everyone experiences when they meditate. So to really understand meditation, we have to understand it in its real world manifestation, which is this cycle of focus followed by mind wandering. And we can actually see that there's research now ongoing in understanding mind wandering, its consequences. So this was a study published by a Harvard research team in our premier journal, Science. They found that people's minds wandered frequently regardless of what they were doing. So we all know this. We all know that our minds wander when we're sitting in the doctor's office or at the bus stop. The interesting finding was that people were less happy when their minds were wandering than when they were not, suggesting that there's an emotional cost to allowing this mind wandering to happen excessively. And the reason for that is in the content of mind wandering. Mind wandering is actually a survival advantage. It allows us to analyze the past and predict the future. And what we're most preoccupied with is survival. Every time we have a survival thought, we have a little bit of a stress response because we don't know if we're going to survive. So if you continue having those kinds of survival thoughts continuously, 24/7, 365 days of the year, you're going to end up with a mood disturbance. And if that mood disturbance continues, you might end up with anxiety or depression. So when we focus our attention in meditation, mind wandering stops because we're focused our attention. You can only do one thing at a time with the attention networks. So at least for the amount of time that we're successfully holding our attention, it's kind of like a holiday from this negative content of mind wandering. But what is more important and more determining over a longer period of time is that we're developing a skill of controlling our attention networks. We are learning how to self-regulate our own attention. In other words, self-regulate our own thought processes. And as we engage this over time, over months and years of practice, we develop a skill we call metacognition, the realization that we are not our thoughts. That we have thoughts, but that's not who we are because we can self-regulate our response to our own thoughts. In fact, we can even change our own thoughts if we choose to. And that is a very significant change with respect to our mental state, because now it puts us in charge. It gives us a sense of self-regulation, self-control over our own thought processes. Now we can see this change in mind wandering and focus during meditation with a study in the brain scanner, which is what this study particularly did. They had people meditate in the scanner. During the focus phase, when people were successfully holding their attention, they were activating the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is in the frontal lobes, the executive regions of the brain where the attention networks are. So that makes sense. But when the mind slipped into mind wandering during meditation, what was being activated was a very different pattern of brain activity. It's the so-called default mode network, much more diffuse collection of brain regions. And we're starting to understand the neurophysiology and neuroscience of all of this. We're starting to see that the prefrontal cortex has inhibitory connections. It can quiet down the limbic system or the emotional brain. In fact, long-term meditators actually have a shrunken amygdala, which is at the core of the limbic system. Because they become less emotionally reactive to their own thought processes, they activate their emotional brain less and it becomes smaller. We also know that people that spend much more time in the default mode network with rumination are much more prone to developing mood disturbance and ultimately mental health conditions. And we know that meditation is actually now being used as a treatment for many mental health conditions. So we're starting to really understand the neuroscience of how the brain responds and changes with meditation practice. This cartoon reads, "Thanks to yoga, I now gently stretch to conclusions instead of jumping to them." And so this would be a cartoon that really represents this idea of metacognition, our changed relationships to our own thought processes, our change in reactivity to those thoughts. Now, I've been talking so far a good deal about stress, and there's a good deal of evidence that yoga is very good at stress management. In fact, it's one of the major reasons we have been coming to yoga practice. This is a survey study we did in Austin, Texas, and we asked beginners, yoga practitioners, why they were coming to yoga practice. Over 70% listed stress management as one of the major reasons. And other surveys have really confirmed this. And in fact, other surveys have gone farther and looked at long-term practitioners and asked them why they have continued yoga practice. And stress becomes even stronger an indicator. So people might start yoga practice for fixing their knee, but then continue yoga practice because it's been helping with their stress. So it's a major factor. This also shows up in the research literature, and virtually every study, I would say, that has really measured stress in response to a yoga intervention has shown improvements, not just in subjective measures of stress using stress questionnaires, but even in stress-related physiological measures. Things like the stress hormone cortisol, systolic blood pressure, heart rate, high-frequency heart rate variability, blood glucose, and blood lipids. And all of these showing improved regulation of the sympathetic nervous system and the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal system, the two different stress systems in our bodies. And we can see this from examples, and I'm just showing you examples of some of our recent research. This is a study we did in education professionals using a Kripalu yoga program that's specifically designed for workplace environments. And this was a yoga intervention over a few weeks, and primarily these education professionals were teachers. And what we found was that in this randomized controlled trial, they were both at these higher levels. The yoga group reduced its levels of stress at the end of the intervention, and 2 months later, they had still managed to keep those levels of perceived stress low. We also measured resilience to stress and showed that the yoga group had increases by the long-term follow-up, whereas the controls that didn't practice yoga had no change over time. Frankly, counselor, I don't care how stressful this is for your client. Tell them to get out of that damn yoga position. Now, another thing that comes from practice over time is an increase in mind-body awareness. Now, mind-body awareness is a term that I view as synonymous with the term mindfulness. We become more sensitive, we become more aware of our internal state. And we actually have evidence that yoga does improve mindfulness. This was a survey study of long-term yoga practitioners conducted in Germany. And they divided up the yoga practitioners into those that were practicing at a high level, those that were practicing moderately, and those that were practicing marginally. And these are scores of mindfulness on this scale here. And what you can see is that obviously the higher level practitioners had more mindfulness than those that were practicing less, and there's a dose-response relationship. Furthermore, we can even see these changes over the short term. So in those same education professionals, mostly teachers, we were able, after the end of the program, to see significant improvements in mindfulness scores that were maintained at the 2-month follow-up. So these are skills that are improving, changing. We're increasing their mind-body awareness in a permanent way. Another feature of yoga, of course, goes back to its original roots, and that is yoga meaning union, the whole idea that yoga can lead to these unitive states of consciousness. And we can see these changes over a temporal course. So over the short term, we have experienced, and this can happen over minutes or certainly over a yoga class, we get this sense of physical arousal reduction, an improvement in physical mental well-being. This has been characterized as the relaxation response, the opposite of the fight or flight or stress response. But as we develop yoga practice and continue with regular practice over weeks and months, we develop skills. We improve mind-body awareness, we're improving resilience to stress, and our self-regulation of our thought processes and even of our physiological functioning. But what many people experience over a longer-term practice, and this can be called a yoga lifestyle that may typically take months and years to manifest. Many people talk about a psychological or philosophical transformation. People will say things like, yoga changed my life. I've heard people say things like, yoga saved my life. This is a very profound thing to say. It reflects a much deeper change. People have changed something about their perspective on life, their relationship to themselves and the rest of the world. And I think this comes from the deeper experiences that can occur, typically with meditative practices within yoga. That same German study quantified this. They developed a questionnaire on spiritual well-being and showed, again, that the higher level practitioners experienced the higher levels of spiritual well-being than did those that practiced moderately or marginally. And on subscales of that questionnaire in positive psychological states like hope, connectedness, and experiences of sense and meaning. Once again, it's the higher level practitioners that experience higher degrees of these very positive psychological states. And again, we can see this over the short term. This was a study we did with young adult musicians. And young adult musicians, or musicians as a whole, often experience the flow state, this immersion in their activity, which is a very deep and powerful unitive state of consciousness. And what you can see is that after 6 weeks of yoga, these musicians had increases in the scores of the flow state. And in a subscale of that questionnaire, autotelic experience, which is that unitive state, again, we can see that increase compared to the controls that didn't practice yoga. So it actually is possible to measure these kinds of sort of spiritually oriented changes even over the short term. This brings me to a very important slide, which really sort of describes all we know about how yoga works. So yoga is not, in my view, just the postures, but breathing, relaxation, meditation, the whole component. Most of the yoga research has been done in all of these. Either of these components, either individually, alone, or together, improve physical functioning, which I'm calling fitness, things like flexibility, strength, coordination, balance, respiratory function, and ultimately self-efficacy. All four of these, either independently or together, improve self-regulation, as we've talked about, in terms of stress and emotion regulation, leading to these skills of resilience to stress and equanimity in the function of emotional reactivity, leading to an overall psychological self-efficacy. The meditative component is largely responsible for improving a mind-body awareness. Through the engagement of the attention networks, you become more functional, more mindful. That improves concentration and cognition, and ultimately over time leads to this very powerful state of metacognition. And then finally, it's largely through the meditative contemplative components of yoga that we improve things that I'm calling spirituality. Things like the unitive state, transcendence, flow, leading to this sort of deeper transformation and change in life, meaning, and purpose. One thing you can see from this is we're making changes across a broad spectrum from gross physical level to the deepest experiences that humans can have. And we all have evidence for many of these different boxes. And now we can talk about how these changes really affect different functions and how these different constructs and these different changes can be relevant to different circumstances. So if we're talking about children and yoga in schools, stress and resilience is very important. Emotion regulation is very important. Concentration, cognition for academic performance can be very important. Physical health with the obesity epidemic we have in the US is very important. Because we're making these changes across a broad spectrum, we're seeing changes with yoga in global human functionality, from the gross level of physical and mental health and performance to the deeper experiences and skills of stress and emotion regulation, awareness, mindfulness, and ultimately metacognition. And then finally, deepest experiences of positive psychological changes, well-being, values, life purpose and meaning, and what we can think of as pure spirituality. So this is the benefit that we can think of when we talk about applying traditional yoga to any population. And this, of course, applies to both children and adolescents as well as school settings. So now you have more information when you go to the health club. You can now be one with yourself and clear your mind with yoga, or choose to continue to be oblivious and mindless with a TV and a treadmill. So now let's turn our attention to the challenges that we face in our students and children and adolescents. We have a wide variety of different challenges from K to 12. Stress is amongst the biggest, which is really responsible for triggering a lot of its subsequent ones. These can be from a variety of different issues with children, developmental issues, family, social, academic, and societal issues. That can be a major risk factor for mental health problems, including depression, anxiety, substance abuse, trauma, behavioral problems, including apathy, violence, bullying, absenteeism. And then, of course, stress can negatively impact, and mood disturbance can negatively impact academics, and then also physical health. And then we're seeing a raft of attention problems appearing in our children and adolescents. So there's a host of problems in our children, mental health being very important. This is from the National Youth Risk Behavior Survey in 2017 in the US, and it's just one example of one of the many constructs that is really showing severe problems. In the United States, 17.2% of high school students have seriously considered attempting suicide. This is a stunning statistic. And when you look at the disparity, it's females, 22% of female high school students have seriously considered attempting suicide. So these are very sobering statistics. We also see that the majority of seriously impairing and persistent conditions in adulthood have child-adolescent onsets. And they're also the ones that have comorbidity, the more serious ones. And there's also a need for treatment of largely untreated child-adolescent disorders. So mental health is a huge problem in adults, and it starts in adolescence. And the prevalence of mental health problems in adolescents and in children is very severe. This is a very disturbing study that was conducted a number of years ago, following children from age 9 to 21, looking at the appearance of psychiatric disorders. The conclusion from this study was that most likely lifetime prevalence of psychiatric problems by age 21 well exceeds 80%, suggesting that the experience of psychiatric illness is nearly universal. Now, this is a huge problem, this mental health problem. Most people don't really recognize it, but if you ask any teacher or school principal, they simply nod their heads and say, yeah, we experience this day to day. Of course this is happening. So what about yoga for children and adolescents? Well, there's a number of yoga programs out there specifically designed for children. These are some of them. This is Yoga Kids. This is the Yoga for Youth program based upon Kundalini yoga practice. There's a number of books out there, of course, targeted at children. Yoga for Kids, Yoga, You Are Aligned, I Am Yoga, Go, Yoga for Kids, Yoga for Children, etc. And it's gone even into not just yoga for kids, but yoga for therapy, yoga for the special child, for autism and special needs. So this is a growing area of interest. And we also have the National Kids Yoga Conference, which is an annual conference which brings together experts and even some researchers that I help coordinate to talk about this whole movement of yoga for children and adolescents. We're starting to get yoga researchers and researchers publish review papers. This is a review by Lisa Cayley Isley that's easily accessible, talking about yoga as a complementary therapy for children and adolescents from the clinical perspective. This is from the American Academy of Pediatrics journal, Mindbody Therapies in Children and Youth, really talking about the benefits of yoga. We've also included a chapter in our book, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare, on the studies that have been done on yoga therapy for pediatrics. There are other review papers now even more recently published. This one's on looking at symptoms of anxiety and depression in children and adolescents, a systematic review, and that showing that these studies generally lead to reductions in anxiety and depression in use regardless of health status and intervention characteristics. This is a review paper we published fairly recently in 2020, also showing that the results indicate growing evidence that yoga is a promising intervention for children and youth. And when we look at the demonstrated benefits from a lot of studies that have been done in children, particularly with medical psychological conditions, we're seeing the same kinds of outcomes that we see in adults: stress, anxiety, depression, self-concept, cognitive function, memory, perception, flexibility, cardiopulmonary fitness, psychomotor and neuromuscular performance, and weight loss. Really no difference than in adults. So yoga works for children and adolescents just as it works in adults. So this brings us to yoga in schools. What's the rationale for bringing yoga into schools? Well, our schools, unfortunately, do not accommodate this other aspect of life. They don't accommodate essentially mental health conditions. They don't accommodate stress, resilience, mindfulness, all of these other constructs that allow us to avoid problems. In fact, schools were originally developed in this factory model. Schools were built to train future factory workers during the Industrial Revolution. The belief was the back door of the school leads to the front door of the factory, and students should only be taught the essential skills required to become a successful factory worker. Problem is, in modern society, with the stresses we have, all of these wonderful trained workers now have depression, anxiety, and a host of other mental health conditions. So we're not really doing service to our children by leaving out this important aspect of whole education. And this has been recognized by a number of groups. This has been recognized by the Center for Disease Control in the United States, who've talked about this initiative for whole school, whole community, whole child model, in which health education, physical education, physical activity, nutrition information Counseling is provided. Employee wellness, family engagement, a sort of a whole model of developing a child. And the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning has really argued for this. They've talked about multiple domains: self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision making. And from our logic model, you can easily see that yoga accommodates a lot of these constructs that have been promoted by the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning. So where are we with the schools? Well, it's been recognized that we've left out this aspect of human education. In fact, a leading educator back in the 1900s, and back in 1914, he made the prediction that the health and welfare of a child will be regarded as one of as much importance as arithmetic and geography. I'm sorry to say that over 100 years later, this has not come true. And we have this huge mental health burden in our children and adolescents in our schools. So how do we get around this? Well, yoga. Let's talk about yoga in schools. And we published this paper a number of years ago, really as an armamentarium for yoga teachers to be able to take this to the schools as a rationale for why yoga should be implemented in the school curriculum. We described the problems in the schools with the mental health situation. We talked about the research that's been done on yoga for children and adolescents and in schools, and we argued for its implementation and its importance in the school setting. And so this paper is the first to describe a theoretical model specifically focused on school-based yoga interventions, as well as the discussion of the similarities and differences between school-based yoga, social-emotional learning, and meditation. We also did a study to look at the growing movement, the grassroots movement of yoga programs for school settings. And what we found was at that time, over 36 programs that offered yoga in more than 940 schools across the United States and had trained more than 5,000 instructors. And so this was the idea was to really promote this idea that yoga in schools is a movement that is in existence and it's growing. Unfortunately, it's a grassroots movement and it's not being implemented really district-wide in any kind of systematic way. Another group that's promoted this has been the Yoga Service Council, who's really promoted yoga practice in underserved populations. They put together this wonderful book, Best Practices for Yoga in Schools, which really is a manual for how to bring yoga into school settings. Information of what to look out for, how to do this, who to interact with. It's really a manual about how to succeed in bringing yoga into schools. And I was able to contribute a short review of the research that's been done on yoga in schools into this book. So there's a number of programs that amongst those 36 that have been developed for bringing yoga into schools. One of the early ones has been Yoga Ed, that was prominent in the United States. Another one in the United States is Bent on Learning. A Pure Edge is another program, and this program actually had a number of research studies conducted on it in the U.S., and some of these programs were actually administered across districts in Houston, Texas, in Encinitas, California. And a few other locations. The Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health also has developed their program, Kripalu Yoga in Schools Teacher Training, which prepares yoga teachers to be able to go into the yoga school setting. My colleagues and friends at the Holistic Life Foundation have done enormous work with their work bringing yoga into inner city Baltimore schools. And these guys are now world famous for really promoting yoga in underserved schools. I work very closely with the Yoga for Youth program, whose techniques are based upon Kundalini yoga practices. And there is now a growing body of yoga in schools research, although it is limited. In 2016, we published this review paper, and at that point in time, there was only about 40 studies that had been conducted, and there's a wide variety of different types of studies. Many of them were uncontrolled trials or not randomized controlled trials. So it's a very preliminary area of research that is in its infancy and is still growing. And at that time, as I say, there was fewer than 50 studies. Mostly were done in elementary schools. Many did not use control groups. Many were after-school programs. Some of the studies actually had negative results, and there were numerous other methodological weaknesses, and really suffering from a lack of funding to promote these research studies more. So when we look at the temporal appearance of those 41 studies in that paper, you can see that most of it's really been done in the past 20 years or so. But the popularity seems to be growing as we see more of the studies and also a few more of the randomized controlled trials being published. Now, the outcomes that we're seeing, again, are the outcomes we expect to see, and the same outcomes we see in adults: stress coping, self-regulation, physical and emotional arousal improvements, reductions in aggression, hostility, and anger, improvements in mood, anxiety, and depression, reductions in rumination, improvements in cognitive functioning, improvements in self-esteem, mental and social physical well-being, and even behaviors. And just to show you some of the types of results that we've gotten in our studies, our early research started with the Kripalu Center program, and we looked at schools that were near to the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health. And this is a slide that puts together outcomes from a number of interventions that we did over multiple semesters, and looks at a number of specific mood and mental health states. So things like social stress, anxiety, anger, resilience, negative mood, anxiety, and anger expression. And what you can see on this chart is that those that showed improvement in the yoga group is indicated in pink. So you can see that there's not much change. These error bars overlap the zero change. Maybe there's a little change in anger and resilience, but these error bars are fairly large. So these are not significant changes and improvements in these metrics. But look what happened to the control groups. These are the regular students that did not get the yoga. What we're seeing in action is this decline in mental health in our adolescents over the course of a single semester. So what this study is showing is actually prevention. It's preventing this decline in mental health that would occur had yoga not been there. Now, our prediction would be, had this study not been over a single semester, but over 10 years, we would even expect to see improvements in these areas, not just prevention of decline. More recently, I've been working with our Yoga for Youth program in school settings, and we started out with a charter school in Los Angeles, and the Yoga for Youth program really started serving children who were in correctional institutions, but then moved on into schools. And what we found in this particular school setting after the end of the program was improvements in perceived stress, improvements in resilience to stress, and improvements in positive mood state. And this was just a single group trial. In a more controlled study more recently, we found an outcome in difficulties in emotion regulation. So anything that goes down is an improvement. This was a study that was done in our Yoga for Youth program in North Carolina. This was an after-school program. It did have a control group in this case, and we saw yoga showing an improvement in emotion regulation, statistically significantly better than the change, which was very minimal, if any, in the control group. So in terms of qualitative research outcomes, again, a number of studies have actually done interviews with the children in a number of studies. They report positive experiences. They would continue it if it was offered. There's better kinesthetic awareness. There's stress reduction and coping that they talk about. They talk about managing negative emotions. There's more optimism, increased social cohesion with family peers, and an improved school environment. And so just to summarize some of these types of things and really illustrate how our logic model really does play out, I've taken those four elements in our logic model where we see improvements in fitness, self-regulation, mind-body awareness, and spirituality. And I've looked at the studies that we've done and pulled out the quotes that children have that match these changes in our logic model. So in terms of the physical component, which I've called fitness, one student said, "I like to run a lot, and it can usually go better when I feel flexible. And I've been feeling better when I run since practicing yoga. I also ski, and the balance has helped me a lot. I do better trails, harder trails now." Another student said, "I think I've been sleeping deeper and more comfortably because also, along with the foot on the wall, I also do the 3-part breathing so that I can relax myself before I try and fall asleep." In terms of self-regulation, one student said, "I felt like it was easier to calm myself if I was nervous about something, or just like to deal with my stress." Another student said, "Before you're taking a test, relax and breathe, and you don't get as nervous or as tense." Another said, "I used breathing outside the classroom in my life to calm me down. If I was stressed or angry, I would then do the breathing to calm me down, and I will probably continue to do this. This direct evidence of them learning these skills almost immediately and then applying them in their day-to-day life situations. In terms of mind-body awareness, one student said, I learned how to pay attention to how my body feels. I mean, this is mindfulness or interoception, a perfect definition of that. Another student said, respecting how my body works, the poses helped with gaining control over myself. Yoga gave me a new perspective on my body, and I have more control than I thought I did. Another student said, I noticed myself changing, an increase in self-awareness, and it felt like instant gratification. This is not just mindfulness, but also the effects of mindfulness on mood state. And then finally, this last quote really refers to how this mind-body awareness can change behavior. One student said, I've been eating healthier, more fruits and vegetables, and not a lot of junk food, for example, ice cream and candy. And then finally, our studies have been mostly very short term, over a semester, at most a year. So you don't expect to see the kind of changes in spirituality you would expect after years of practice. But there are a few hints in some of these quotes. I am fascinated by the culture of yoga, how people can change their lives and help themselves physically, emotionally. I'm interested in learning more. This really portends to a sort of a change in life trajectory, if you will, in a positive direction. Another student said, I've been a lot more happier lately. I feel like a better person, making better choices and staying out of trouble. And of course, if it's one thing that adolescents need, it's this frontal cortex executive control over their impulsivity and learning how to stay out of trouble. And then we have had yoga in one school from the Kripalu program for a number of years, and we did focus groups with some of the school staff. And this was from the school counselor. He said, yoga has made a huge impact on our school. It is making our school a better place, suggesting this sort of cumulative effect. As you get more and more children practicing these techniques, the whole environment, the whole mental health environment of the school changes as a whole. So I'm acknowledging the Kripalu Center for Yoga and Health, whose program we studied and who put in a good deal of funding to support those research studies. I also work with the International Association of Yoga Therapists, which supports my work. And I also serve as the director of yoga research for the Kundalini Research Institute, which helps me conduct studies on the Yoga for Youth program. And we have a number of citations available on that website of the research that's been done in that style of yoga. I also serve as the director of yoga research for the Yoga Alliance. And my goal and role there is to provide yoga research literacy. And that's providing the research evidence, and we've done that through a form of professionally formatted 7-minute videos, which have shown the research on a number of different elements of practice with different populations, including yoga in schools. And then also over 3 dozen yoga research webinars covering also a variety of different topics, including yoga in schools. And these are all freely accessible through the Yoga Alliance website, and we've done a couple of studies, a couple of webinars on yoga in schools. I also curate a collection of yoga research citations, and these citations all come in different categories, and you can access all these different categories, and these will lead you to, there's a students and education section, and you can see a list of research review papers complete with the links to. Many of them have full text links, and then notable publications, and some of those go to the abstracts, but some of them may also have links to the full papers. And I conclude with this slide, which it's not just Americans. This is an evolution that's happening internationally. We are experiencing literally an epidemic of non-communicable diseases. These include mental health conditions like depression and anxiety, but they also include behavioral problems with lifestyle, including things like obesity, type 2 diabetes, hypertension, cancer. These are all diseases that are due to behavioral issues. These are lifestyle diseases. They're preventable diseases. A lot of them are triggered by the epidemic of chronic stress. And the problem in our society is that we do not have the strategies in our schools to train our children and adolescents into how to behave as functionally healthy human beings, to address not just academic performance, but also psychological, emotional, and spiritual performance. And we need the research to conduct trials that show that yoga belongs in the schools. And once we get a decent body of research, that will convince policymakers to implement yoga district-wide. And hopefully when that happens, and hopefully I won't die before that happens, but hopefully when that happens, we can change this cartoon, hopefully, to this outcome. So thanks very much for your attention. And I believe we have almost 10 minutes for any questions that you might have.
Thank you so much, Satbir. That was fascinating. Really comprehensive review of all the literature, and there's just, you've been so busy, so much research. It's fantastic, really, and it gives us all so much hope, I think, that, for the future, that we can evidence what we want to do in schools, and I wonder what you think about in terms of, when you say you're hoping there'll be a decent body, how much more needs to be done in order for it to be a decent body of research, really?
Well, there's some sad examples and there's some happy examples. So the sad example is smoking. How many decades of research did it take to show that smoking causes cancer, to the extent that governments are prohibiting smoking on public property, that you can't smoke in restaurants, that there's statements on cigarette packages, and huge efforts to eliminate smoking. It took decades and decades of research for that to happen. Hopefully there's better examples where the research doesn't take so long to show that we need to implement things and things are worthy of implementation. So it's an unknown because they're competing. We've got competing issues in the schools. We have to keep up with the Chinese. We have to keep, our technical knowledge, our maths have to be as good as the Chinese. So that's the emphasis in the schools is dropouts in grades, and so we're competing with that. We're talking about suicide rates. We're talking about mental health conditions, and so there's a struggle. And the problem is also the funding for the research. It's difficult to get studies funded in this area. So we're facing a lot of challenges. But fortunately, there are a lot of researchers that are interested in this area. It's growing, but how fast it will grow and how quickly we'll get there is unknown. I mean, we'd love to have a sugar daddy who shows up with, 50 million pounds and says, I want to fund yoga research in schools. And then, 20 researchers could go and do that work. But, we're not there yet.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And it's the same here as it is there, isn't it? It's, I know, Charlotte, you've tried to do a lot with lobbying the Parliament in terms of yoga for schools, haven't you? And I don't know how that is in the US. I'd be interested to hear how it is politically there, but maybe that's for another conversation.
We also have allies in this business. Excuse me. The consortium, the collaborative CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning. They're doing exactly what we're doing, if not even broader in that sense. But there's also a movement for meditation in schools. And so they're working alongside with us as a whole body of research and researchers in that whole area, which I did not show. So that's happening parallel to us. And then there's a whole bunch of conventional approaches of cognitive behavioral therapy and other kinds of training approaches that are trying to be put into the school. So this is being come at from multiple angles.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I've got so many questions I want to ask you, but I do want to make sure that everyone else can ask any questions they want to ask. So whether you want to unmute yourself or put some questions in the chat, it's really up to you. Whilst we're waiting, I'll maybe ask you another question unless I can't see anyone.
Can I jump in?
Oh, yes. Go ahead.
Hi.
Go ahead, Janine.
Thank you so much. This was really, really fascinating. I'm originally from the US, but live here in London, and was just curious. I mean, it sounds like the research was very US focused, but I was just curious if you kind of noticed any aspects of kind of American culture or anything that would sort of influence the research in the US, and if you were familiar with sort of the state of the research in the UK. I know that's kind of a broad question, but just curious if anything came up.
Yeah, much less research in the UK, much less research elsewhere. A little bit more in India, but really it's in the US because frankly, most biomedical research is done in the US. We actually have the National Center for Complementary and Integrative Health, which funds research in yoga in different venues. And I was actually funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse for a trial that we did, showing that yoga could reduce the onset of cigarette smoking in a trial. But it's I think the results are going to be pretty common. I mean, children are children, regardless of what country they're in, regardless of the culture. They're experiencing the same kind of stresses. You know, we're all experiencing the pandemic. They all experience academic stress. They all experience, puberty and the stresses that go with that. And we're all humans, and yoga works on human bodies and human minds in the same way, regardless of whether you're from Ukraine or whether you're from Mexico. It's going to be the same kind of thing. So I think it's good to have research from other countries, because that will broaden the appeal, and different countries will adapt to it differently and accept it differently in some ways. Some countries are more conservative with adoption than other countries are. So it's going to vary in terms of the implementation ultimately. But we need more studies across different countries. There's no question there.
Thank you.
Just as an add-on to that, Janine, I don't know if you're aware of the Hippocampus project that we developed, and that was published in Frontiers in Psychology last month, so you can have a look at that.
I wonder if you could say anything about the challenges of research in young people with mental illness specifically. So I know a lot of the studies have been for just regular schools, but in the actual population of with mental illness.
Yeah, there are studies, and we reviewed that in our paper, most recently published in 2020, and that covered not just that covered yoga for children in general, including yoga in school studies. And so there is a body of evidence there, but again, it's fairly small. There's not that many researchers who are expert in that area. We are in the process of working with Handspring to publish a book called The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Children and Adolescents. And, that was a follow-up to our book, The Principles and Practice of Yoga in Healthcare. And just to show you the demographic, I mean, we've got 60 yoga researchers contributing to that book, and we'll probably have a dozen contributing to this one. So there's many few researchers who are actually conducting yoga in child and adolescent populations.
Yeah, that's where we need some more researchers, isn't it?
Of course,
for sure. Okay, one thing I was wondering as well about, which links into your question, Sophie, you've just asked there about what is the best practice for a yoga session for in all the papers that have come out? I guess they're all different types of yoga and different lengths of sessions.
It's all very different, yeah.
Yeah, and is there any? So
you can't make a conclusion based upon what's out there. It's different styles, it's different approaches, different times, different days. Some are after school, some are in school, some are a few minutes, some are an hour. It's all over the map, and so there's not enough studies for you to sort of pull out something and say, oh, this is common and this is not. I mean, even the qualitative studies show differences. So it's too early to make any conclusions, but I wouldn't be surprised if we see the same things that we see in adults. And the one thing that I can say that's very clear in adults is that yoga that's more multi-component is going to be better than yoga that focuses more on asanas. So an asana dominant form of yoga is not as good as a form of yoga that includes a lot more of the breathing, the relaxation, the meditation component. The more it's targeted towards fewer of the components, the less effective it's going to be. And that obviously makes sense because we know that all 4 of those components have benefits. So if you take one out, you're losing something. And that's why I think yoga is better than meditation. Because yoga is meditation plus pranayama and relaxation and the physical body. So the more you put in, the more you put in, as we do in yoga, you're likely to cover all the bases. And in schools in particular, I think it's particularly advantageous to start with the physical body. You get their energy, contained and released to some degree, and then they can launch into meditation. Whereas a meditation intervention, you're expecting them to immediately launch into meditation at the drop of a hat. And I'm not sure adolescents can do that so well.
No, or younger children at all.
Or younger children, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. There was Elle has just put a thing in about, can you provide the details for that research? I think you're going to provide the link for your slides, isn't that right?
Yeah, I'll provide the PDF and you can share that.
Yeah, that's brilliant. It's just after 6 o'clock now. Has anyone got any last minute questions they'd like to put to Sat?
Eliza is putting her hand up.
Sorry, I didn't see that.
No, that was me just trying to wave. That was incredible. Thank you so much. I'm a pediatric nurse and I've worked in schools a lot. And in schools, we kind of signpost kids to psychological well-being. So there's quite, in theory, on paper, it looks like there's a pathway for if young people come and see you. And I think that's sort of, I don't know, it feels like that's supposed to tick boxes, and maybe that's why we're not prioritizing health in school. And I don't know with the American system whether, from what I understand of it, is you have to pay for healthcare a lot there. And so is it put in as a health intervention in America?
Well, school counselors are a position, and there is a whole field of school counseling. And so that's one place that's been argued for the place to address mental health problems in kids, by having more school counselors with more skills to be able to identify and address problems as they come up. And so that's that. I know I don't know much about that field or that movement, but that is one of the strategies, of course, that's talked about. We need more school counselors. I like to think of it as more fundamental than that. We need basic skills for all of our children to prevent them from reaching that point where they're clinically significant that they need a counselor. Exactly. I want to go back a step and say, I'm going to give them the skills that prevent that from happening in the first place.
I completely agree. And I think I wonder whether, because we tick a box, we send them off to counsellors and they don't exist. There's not enough of them. But I wonder if that's why in the UK we haven't prioritised it, because on paper it looks like everything's being done. I know everybody knows it isn't, but I just thought maybe that was the difference.
I think there are the new mental health in schools teams as well, which have come from CAMS into schools. So I think that's beginning to change a little bit. But I think, like Charlotta's talked about as well before, it's getting it into the PSHE education from very, very early on as well, isn't it? Right from year R, getting them doing yoga right from the start, I think. Yeah, prevention versus cure, as you say, Charlotta. Okay, well, thank you so much for your time. And I think everyone's feeling very inspired. And I know you said, if anyone's got any particular research related questions, then they're welcome to get in touch with you via getting in touch with Charlotta or any of the other Teen Yoga crew. But yeah, thank you very much, and good luck with the rest of your research. We look forward to seeing what you do next.
Wonderful.
Thank you.
Thank you, Satbir. Lovely to see you.
Thank you.
Well done, Jo.
Thank you. I'm just going to stop recording.